A young rookie officer walked into the courtroom with confidence, acting like he was in charge. He had only been on the job for 6 months, but he already believed his badge gave him the highest authority in the room. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Emmanuel Carter sat calmly, watching. He had spent years in this courtroom handling all kinds of cases and people. He had seen arrogance before, but this was something else. The officer didn't realize he had just stepped into the one place where his badge held no power. The rookie thought he could challenge the judge's authority and get away with it. He had no idea what was about to happen. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before we get into this story, tell us, have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Judge Emmanuel Carter sat behind the bench, his hands folded neatly as he watched the young officer enter the courtroom. The rookie, Officer Ryan Wilkes, walked with a sense of superiority, his shoulders squared, his chin high. He had only been on the force for 6 months, but already he carried himself like he had been upholding the law for years. Judge Carter, on the other hand, had spent over 30 years in the justice system. He had seen men like Wilkes before, young, full of confidence, but lacking wisdom. He knew that arrogance mixed with authority was dangerous. Officer Wilkes stood near the defendant's table, gripping the arm of a man in handcuffs. The defendant, a middle-aged black man, looked nervous, but remained quiet. Wilkes had been assigned to transport him to court, but there was one problem. He refused to remove the handcuffs. Judge Carter looked at Wilkes with calm authority. "Officer, remove the defendant's handcuffs. He has the right to sit in this courtroom without restraints unless he is a threat." Wilkes smirked. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I think we should keep them on. We both know these guys can be dangerous." The room fell silent. The prosecutor's face tightened. Even some of the other officers standing near the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. His face remained calm, but his eyes held a sharpness that made even experienced lawyers nervous. "Excuse me." Wilkes shrugged, keeping his grip on the defendant. "Sir, I just don't think it's safe. I know the law, but sometimes you've got to use common sense. Not everyone deserves the same treatment." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. A rookie officer was telling a judge how to handle his own courtroom. Some people shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, sensing that something big was about to happen. Judge Carter exhaled slowly and tapped his fingers on the bench. He had spent years fighting for fairness, ensuring that people, especially those often mistreated by the system, were given their full rights. And now, standing before him, was a young officer who thought he knew better. He studied Wilkes for a long moment before speaking. "Officer Wilkes, do you know who I am?" Wilkes chuckled under his breath, crossing his arms. "Yes, sir. You're the judge." Judge Carter's eyes darkened. "Then you should know that in this courtroom my word is the law. Now, remove the handcuffs." The room was thick with tension. People were waiting to see if Wilkes would back down, or if he would make the biggest mistake of his career. The courtroom fell into complete silence. All eyes were on Officer Ryan Wilkes, who stood stiffly by the defendant's side. His jaw clenched. His grip on the defendant's arm tightened. He had never been challenged like this before, especially not by a judge. Judge Emmanuel Carter kept his gaze steady, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Wilkes, I will not ask you again. Remove the defendant's handcuffs. In this courtroom, defendants are innocent until proven guilty. Wilkes let out a small scoff, shaking his head. With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't think you understand the risks. His voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. Guys like this, they take any chance they can get to run. I'm just doing my job, keeping things under control. A few murmurs spread through the room. Some people shifted in their seats, sensing the tension boiling beneath the surface. Others looked between the judge and the officer, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Carter slowly placed his hands on the bench, leaning forward slightly. Officer Wilkes, let me explain something to you. Your job is to enforce the law, not to interpret it. That is my job. Wilkes folded his arms over his chest. And, with all due respect, sir, some laws don't make sense in the real world. The room stirred again. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to speak, but he hesitated. Everyone could see it now. This wasn't just about one pair of handcuffs. This was about power. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. Are you saying that the laws you swore to uphold don't apply when you disagree with them? Wilkes stiffened. He had walked into the courtroom expecting to be respected, expecting to be in charge. But now he was on the defensive. He opened his mouth, trying to find the right words, but before he could speak, the judge continued. Officer Wilkes, do you know the legal procedure for handling a defendant in court? Wilkes hesitated. Well, I know how to handle criminals, sir. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. Is that so? Then tell me, officer, what specific policy allows you to keep a defendant in restraints after they have been brought? Before a judge? Without a court order? Wilkes froze. His mouth opened, then closed. He didn't have an answer. Judge Carter waited for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch. Then he leaned back in his chair and spoke clearly. There is no such policy. A murmur swept through the room. Even the officers standing in the back exchanged uneasy glances. Wilkes shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, Your Honor, Judge Carter held up a hand, cutting him off. No, Officer Wilkes, you've already said that 3 times, and each time it was followed by disrespect. His voice remained calm, but the authority behind it was undeniable. The rookie felt his confidence slipping. He glanced around the courtroom, realizing that the crowd was no longer on his side. Judge Carter's voice lowered, steady and unshaken. You came into my courtroom thinking your badge gave you more power than the law itself. But let me make this clear. Your badge does not overrule the Constitution. It does not overrule due process. And it certainly does not overrule me. Wilkes swallowed hard. He could feel his face growing hot. He had come in thinking he was in control. Now, he was standing in front of a courtroom where everyone was witnessing his mistake. Judge Carter took a slow breath. Now, I will give you 2 choices, Officer Wilkes. You will remove the defendant's handcuffs and follow proper courtroom procedure. Or, I will hold you in contempt of court for failing to follow a direct order from a judge. The room went silent again. No one dared to move. Wilkes gritted his teeth. He had no choice. Slowly, he reached down and unfastened the cuffs. They clattered loudly against the table as he pulled them off. Judge Carter nodded. That's better. Now take a seat. Wilkes hesitated for a moment, then lowered himself into a chair, his face burning with embarrassment. The room remained still, the weight of the moment sinking in. Everyone had just witnessed a powerful shift. The young officer had challenged the judge's authority, and he had lost. And the way Judge Carter looked at him made it clear. This lesson wasn't over yet. Officer Wilkes sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw tight, his face burning. He had just been forced to remove the handcuffs from the defendant in front of an entire courtroom. His authority had been challenged, and worse, he had lost. But as much as he wanted to fight back, he knew he had no choice. Judge Carter had made sure of that. The courtroom remained completely silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Judge Carter, still calm and composed, watched Wilkes carefully. He wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about one rookie officer making a mistake. This was about something bigger, the unchecked arrogance that came with power. The judge folded his hands in front of him. Officer Wilkes, since you have decided to challenge my authority in this courtroom, let's continue this discussion. You seem to have strong opinions on how justice should be served. Tell me, what is the role of a police officer in the justice system? Wilkes shifted uncomfortably. To enforce the law, sir. Judge Carter nodded. Good, and what is my role? Wilkes hesitated. To rule on cases? The judge raised an eyebrow. Is that all? Wilkes licked his lips, struggling. He had never been questioned like this before. He had spent 6 months following orders, arresting suspects, writing reports, but no one had ever asked him to think beyond that. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. Let me help you, officer. Your job is to enforce the law. My job is to interpret and uphold the law. And together, we ensure that justice is served fairly. But justice is not just about arrests. It is about rights. It is about fairness. And it is about following the very laws you claim to enforce. Wilkes's fingers curled into fists in his lap. He wanted to argue, but what could he say? The judge wasn't yelling. He wasn't attacking him. He was simply stating the truth. The courtroom remained tense. The audience watched, captivated, as a rookie officer, who had walked in so sure of himself, was now being made to confront his own ignorance. Judge Carter continued, his voice measured. Do you know how many cases I've seen where an officer acted beyond their authority? How many men and women, innocent people, were treated unfairly simply because the officer believed they were above the law? Wilkes swallowed hard. He didn't answer. The judge's voice grew heavier. I have presided over wrongful conviction cases. I have ruled on lawsuits against officers who abused their power. I have listened to the testimonies of families who lost loved ones because someone in uniform thought their authority was absolute. And today, Officer Wilkes, I see that same mindset standing before me. Wilkes felt a lump rise in his throat. His arrogance had brought him here, but now it was gone. Judge Carter let the silence linger before speaking again. Tell me, Officer Wilkes, when you joined the police force, what oath did you take? Wilkes hesitated, then muttered, To protect and serve. Judge Carter nodded. And today, who were you protecting? Who were you serving? The question hit like a slap. Wilkes had no answer. The courtroom stayed silent, waiting. Everyone had expected to see a young officer prove himself. Instead, they saw a lesson in humility. Finally, Wilkes exhaled shakily. No one, sir. His voice was quieter now, his confidence completely gone. Judge Carter studied him for a moment before speaking. Let this be your first real lesson, Officer Wilkes. Power without wisdom is dangerous. Your badge is not a license to control people. It is a responsibility to serve them. The moment you forget that, you fail your duty." Wilkes lowered his head. He had thought he knew everything about justice, but today he had learned what justice really meant. Judge Carter turned to the court clerk. "Let the record show that this case will proceed fairly, as all cases should. Officer Wilkes's actions today will be noted for review." The clerk nodded, writing quickly. The prosecutor, who had remained silent, let out a slow breath. Even the other officers in the courtroom looked at Wilkes differently now. The rookie had walked in believing he had control. Now, he understood that control meant nothing without respect. Judge Carter looked at Wilkes one last time. "I hope you remember this lesson, officer, because the next time you step into a courtroom, you won't be the one giving orders. You will be the one expected to follow them." Wilkes nodded slowly. For the first time since he walked in, he truly understood. The tension in the room finally eased. The lesson had been delivered, and everyone there had witnessed it. Officer Wilkes sat quietly in his chair, his confidence completely gone. He had walked into the courtroom thinking he had the most authority in the room, but now he understood just how wrong he was. The weight of Judge Carter's words still hung in the air, pressing down on him. The courtroom remained silent, the audience still absorbing what had just happened. Then the unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a senior officer stepped inside. The man, Captain James Holloway, a veteran of the police force, walked in with a stern expression. He had seen everything. Wilkes looked up, his face paling. He knew who Holloway was, a respected officer who had trained many rookies and had no tolerance for reckless behavior. If he was here, things were about to get even worse. Captain Holloway walked straight to the front of the courtroom, turning to Judge Carter. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Carter gave him a nod. "Go ahead, Captain." Holloway turned to Wilkes, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Officer Wilkes, I just watched everything that happened, and I have to say, I'm deeply disappointed." Wilkes swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists in his lap. The captain continued, "I trained you myself. I taught you that the law comes before personal opinion. Yet today, you walked into this courtroom and ignored the very oath you swore to uphold." Wilkes lowered his head. "Sir, But he had no excuse. "Captain." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Tell me something, officer. Do you know who Judge Carter is?" Wilkes hesitated. "He's a judge, sir." Holloway shook his head. "No, he is not just a judge. Judge Carter was once a top prosecutor for civil rights cases. He has personally held corrupt officers accountable and fought against wrongful convictions. The policies you ignored today, he helped create some of them, and you had the audacity to challenge him in his own courtroom?" A shocked murmur spread through the room. People had already been impressed by Judge Carter's control over the situation, but now they realized just how powerful his words truly were. Wilkes felt the air leave his lungs. He had spent the last few months on the job believing that he knew everything about justice, but standing before him was a man who had fought for fairness his entire life. Judge Carter finally spoke. "Officer Wilkes, what happens next is up to your department, but I suggest you take this as a moment to reflect, because if you do not understand the law you are enforcing, you will only become a danger to the very people you swore to protect." Wilkes nodded slowly. His face was still tight with shame, but this time there was something else in his eyes. Understanding. Captain Holloway turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I will be handling this situation personally. Officer Wilkes will be placed under review, and we will ensure he receives the proper training. This will not happen again." Judge Carter studied the captain for a moment, then gave a small nod. "See that it doesn't." Wilkes sat frozen in his seat as he listened to his fate being decided. He had thought he was walking into the courtroom to prove his strength, but instead he had just received the most humbling lesson of his life. As the court clerk continued taking notes, Wilkes let out a slow breath. He had made a mistake, but now he had a choice: learn from it or let his pride destroy him. And from the way the entire courtroom was watching him, he knew that whatever choice he made, the world would remember this day. Officer Wilkes sat motionless, absorbing everything that had just happened. His chest felt tight, his pride bruised. Just moments ago he had been so sure of himself, convinced that he had control. But now, with his reputation hanging in the balance and his captain standing over him, he realized something that made his stomach sink. He had been wrong. Captain Holloway stood tall beside him, watching carefully. He had trained Wilkes, but today he had witnessed firsthand how arrogance could blind an officer from his duty. The captain cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Wilkes, stand up." Wilkes hesitated for a second, then obeyed, rising to his feet. His uniform, which once made him feel powerful, now felt heavy on his shoulders. Judge Carter remained calm as he looked at the young officer. He had seen countless men in Wilkes's position, young, eager to prove themselves, but dangerously unaware of the responsibility that came with their authority. The judge clasped his hands together and spoke with purpose. "Officer Wilkes, today you learned an important lesson. The badge you wear does not make you more powerful than the law. It does not put you above the people you serve." Wilkes nodded stiffly, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, to say he never meant to be disrespectful, but deep down he knew that actions spoke louder than words. The courtroom was still full, but the atmosphere had changed. Earlier, people had watched to see a cocky officer get put in his place. Now they watched with a different kind of interest. Would Wilkes learn from this? Or would he let his pride ruin him? Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Officer Wilkes, do you regret what you did today?" Wilkes's hands clenched slightly at his sides. He had spent years believing that admitting weakness was a sign of failure. But now, standing in front of a judge who had just stripped away his false sense of superiority, he understood that real strength came from learning. He exhaled slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." A murmur swept through the courtroom. No one had expected that response. Judge Carter gave a small nod. "Then prove it." Wilkes blinked. "Sir?" Captain Holloway stepped forward. "The judge is giving you an opportunity, Wilkes. He could have ended your career right here, right now. But instead, he's giving you a choice. Learn and do better, or let this mistake define you." Wilkes looked down for a moment, thinking. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, believing that authority meant control. But he had been wrong. Authority meant responsibility, and he had failed at that today. When he finally lifted his gaze, his expression was different. There was no more arrogance, no more resistance, just a young officer who had learned a hard lesson. "I want to do better," Wilkes said firmly. "I need to do better." Judge Carter studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke clearly. "Then start by listening. Learn from those who have been here longer than you. Understand that the law is not about proving your strength. It is about ensuring fairness." Wilkes nodded again, this time with real conviction. Captain Holloway turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I will personally oversee Officer Wilkes's retraining. He will complete an intensive program on courtroom procedures and the rights of defendants before he is allowed back in this position." Judge Carter gave a satisfied nod. "That is exactly what should happen." The courtroom began to stir as the reality of the moment set in. This wasn't just about one officer, this was about accountability, about recognizing that power, if unchecked, could easily turn into abuse. As Wilkes prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at Judge Carter. "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was quiet, but it carried real sincerity. Judge Carter simply nodded. "Make this lesson count, officer." Wilkes walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, not in arrogance but in determination. He had come in with a false sense of authority, but he was leaving with something far more valuable: humility. As the doors closed behind him, the audience in the courtroom began murmuring once more. Some nodded in approval, while others whispered about how they had never seen a rookie officer humbled in such a way. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. Another lesson had been taught. Another officer had been reminded of what justice truly meant. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As Officer Wilkes walked out of the courtroom, his steps were slower, more thoughtful. He had entered that room believing his badge made him untouchable. But now, he understood. Authority meant nothing without responsibility. Judge Carter watched him go, knowing that today's lesson wasn't just for Wilkes. It was for every officer who thought power came before justice. It was for every person in that courtroom who had seen the system fail too many times. And most importantly, it was a reminder that respect for the law must go both ways. This is the reality of justice. Some people learn the easy way, others learn the hard way. Today, Officer Wilkes learned the hard way. But at least he learned. What do you think? Should more officers be required to undergo extra training on courtroom procedures and fair treatment? Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story made you think, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more eye-opening stories. Justice is not about power. It's about truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect is earned, not given. See you in the next story.